I'm Anynewprovince, and is this possibly Pauper Playable? That's the question I want to answer about Hordling Outburst, a card that was downshifted with the release of Masters 25 on Magic the Gathering Online, meaning we can now play it in our Pauper decks. Hordeling Outburst is a very efficient token producer. It costs 1 red. It's a sorcery, and it says, create 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. There are a few places I think Hordeling Outburst could be super effective. The first thing I tried was a modified version of Matra MTG's red-green tokens build. I'll link the replay videos from their YouTube channel down below. It turns out that that deck is rock solid as it is, and it was very difficult to get enough green mana to continuously cast Sprout Swarm while still having enough red mana to cast Hordeling Outburst on time. Goblins is already an established archetype in the Pauper metagame, and there are tons of cards that synergize with having a lot of goblins on the battlefield. That's a great place for Hordeling Outburst, but Kung Fu Trees identified exactly how Hordeling Outburst should fit in that shell first. I'll link what Kung Fu Trees ended up doing with the card in the description down below. I decided to recklessly abandon the ideas that those deck builders had for Hordeling Outburst, and instead I revisited one of the first Pauper decks I ever built. It had to do with just spamming the board with tons of goblin tokens while getting lots of triggers off of impact tremors. But enough of my nostalgic ramblings, let me introduce you to the deck that I call Boros Outburst. This deck is all about swarming the battlefield with a horde of goblin tokens. I'll explain how I intend to produce those tokens first. This is Kuldotha Rebirth. Kuldotha Rebirth costs 1, it's a sorcery, and it says, as an additional cost to cast Kuldotha Rebirth, sacrifice an artifact. A pretty high cost, but the effect is create 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. Next is Mogg War Marshal. It costs 1 and a red, it's a 1/1, it has Echo 1 and a red, which means at the beginning of your upkeep, if this came under your control since the beginning of your last upkeep, sacrifice it unless you pay its Echo cost. This adds a lot of complexity to playing Mogg War Marshal, but we'll see how that plays out in the league. Mogg War Marshal's ability is, when Mogg War Marshal enters the battlefield or dies, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. Our last token producers are a little bit more expensive, but they're absolutely worth the investment. First, we have Beetleback Chief, which costs 2 red. It's a 2/2 Goblin Warrior, and it says, when Beetleback Chief enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. It synergizes really well with the rest of our deck, and it's pretty much an instant board state if it can resolve. We don't have a ton of spells that help us survive in the late game, but this last token producer does exactly that. This is Sen's Enlistment, it costs 3 and a white, and it says create 2 1/1 white Kithkin Soldier creature tokens. That's a little underwhelming, but it also has Retrace, which says you may cast this card from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to paying its other costs. Having a lot of 1/1 tokens can sometimes do the trick, but because cards like Thraben Inspector and Augur of Boros are so popular, we've got to find a way to push our token damage through. The first card we're going to use to do this is Rally the Peasants. It costs 2 and a white, it's an instant, and it says, creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. It has Flashback for 2 and a red, which means you may cast this card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, then exile it. We can sometimes get 2 activations of Rally the Peasants in a single turn, and that's usually way more power than our opponent can deal with. Our big payoff for casting all of these token producers is Impact Tremors. It costs 1 and a red, it's an enchantment, and it says, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, Impact Tremors deals 1 damage to each opponent. We get 3 triggers off of this with Beetleback Chief alone, and there's ways in our deck to recur Beetleback Chief and get those triggers to light up again. Speaking of recursion, we borrowed a few cards from the Boros Monarch archetype in order to create our card advantage package. It starts with Core Skyfisher, which costs 1 and a white, it's a 2/3, it has flying, and it says, when Core Skyfisher enters the battlefield, return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. We're not just picking up Beetleback Chiefs with this. Another target for Core Skyfisher to recur is Ichor Wellspring. It costs 2 mana, and it says, when Ichor Wellspring enters the battlefield or is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. Not only are we going to be able to pick this up with our Core Skyfisher to draw more cards, we can also sacrifice it to trigger its second clause with our Kuldotha Rebirth. Our other bounce-friendly artifact is Prophetic Prism. It also costs 2 mana, and it says, when Prophetic Prism enters the battlefield, draw a card. That's pretty great on its own, but it also has 1, tap, add 1 mana, of any color to your mana pool. This allows us to lean a little bit more heavily into red so that we can cast our Hordling Outbursts on time while still casting all the white spells that we want to. Sometimes you don't have to attack with your goblin tokens to win the game. This card takes advantage of the fact that they're just a warm body to sacrifice. It's called Reckless Abandon, it costs 1 red, and it says, as an additional cost, to cast Reckless Abandon, sacrifice a creature. Reckless Abandon deals 4 damage to target creature or player. Our last non-land card is Galvanic Blast, which really rounds out the burn package nicely. Galvanic Blast costs 1 red mana, it's an instant, and it says, Galvanic Blast deals 2 damage to target creature or player. It also has Metalcraft, which is an ability our deck doesn't trigger as consistently as some decks, but we can get there most of the time. When we control 3 or more artifacts, Galvanic Blast deals 4 damage to its target instead. Okay, let's have a look at this mana base. First, we have Ancient Den, which is an artifact land, and it taps for white mana. It's going to help us turn Metalcraft online. We also have Boros Garrison, which is a Karoo land, and that means it enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, we return a land we control to our hand. It helps you cheat on mana a little bit, and it helps you recur powerful lands you also run in your deck. Powerful lands like Forgotten Cave, which enters the battlefield tapped, but also cycles for red mana. We're also running Radiant Fountain, which is pretty great to bounce. It only taps for colorless mana, but when it enters the battlefield, it gains us 2 life. We're running 4 Great Furnace, more artifact lands, but these ones tap for red, and we're also running 2 Windscarred Crags. Standard Pauper duels, but they enter the battlefield tapped, gain you a life, and when they become untapped, they can tap for a red or a white. Finally, we have 5 snow-covered mountains and 2 snow-covered plains. No particular reason that we're running snow-covered lands, except they look kind of nice, and they might also convince our opponent we are on a different type of deck. And here's the sideboard. First, we have 4 Soul Wardens for gaining us a life whenever one of our tokens enters the battlefield. Hopefully this will give us an edge over hyper-aggressive decks and burn. We have 2 Electrickeries for sweeping up our opponent's X1s, or if they bring in hate like Shrivel and Crypt Rats for our X1s, we can hold this back and use it to deal with their X2s. We have 2 Gorilla Shamans for stone raiding the crap out of Affinity. We have 2 Standard Bearers for picking up all of our opponent's auras. We have 2 Journey to Nowheres as catch-all removal just in case our burn spells can't deal with our opponent's threats. And we have 3 Hydroblasts for countering those blue spells and hopefully stopping those Muldrifters from entering the battlefield. Notably, there's no graveyard hate in our sideboard. I think we can win around Moment's Peace with our Impact Tremors, and if they're casting spells like Mystical Teachings or Forbidden Alchemy out of their graveyard, we should be able to stop them with Pyroblast. Flashback Chainer's Edict? Who cares? There you have it, Boros tokens. We're going to take this deck live into a league at twitch.tv/Anynewprovince on Tuesday night. We're there every Tuesday trying out Possibly Pauper Playable decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thanks so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you on Tuesday night.